A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzlingly white, such as no fuller on earth could bleach them. Then Elijah appeared to them along with Moses, and they were conversing with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus in reply, "Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He hardly knew what to say. They were so terrified. Then a cloud came, casting a shadow over them. From the cloud came a voice, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." Suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone but Jesus alone with them. As they were coming down from the mountain, he charged them not to relate what they had seen to anyone, except when the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what rising from the dead meant. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord.
I would like to share with you a parable entitled Once Upon a Puddle. Once upon a time, there was a small pond, little more than a puddle, really. Day after day, the fish in the puddle would swim around and fight over the water bugs. The little puddle was cradled between the roots of an ancient oak tree beside a flowing river. One morning, the fish were startled by a sudden splash. An amazing, brightly colored fish had jumped into their riverside puddle. Its golden scales were luminous in the few rays of light that managed to shine through the muddy water. "Who are you?" one of the puddle fish asked, "and what are you doing here?" The luminous fish smiled. "I come from the sea." "The sea?" asked the fish. "What's the sea?" "No one ever told you about the sea?" "Why, the sea is what fish are made for. Fish needn't swim in circles all day and fight over a few water bugs. In the sea, fish can dance on the tides of crystal clear water, and there is abundance in the sea for all." A pale gray puddle fish spoke up. "But how do you get to the sea?" "Well, all you have to do is follow me to the river and trust that the current will take you to the sea." One of the pond fish, the realist fish, swam forward with a hard, experienced look in his eye. "Talk of the sea is fine, but we have to face reality. We know this pond. We know how to hunt for water bugs. We can survive here just fine." "But you don't understand," the luminous fish said. "I come from the sea. I've been there. It's far more wonderful than you can imagine." But the realist fish snickered and swam away. The nervous fish then worked up the courage to speak. Do you mean we're supposed to jump into that big river?" the nervous fish stammered. "Yes, the way lies through the river," the luminous fish explained. "Trust me." But the nervous fish scurried away before the luminous fish could finish. The professional fish then interjected, "Our distinguished visitor's proposal deserves consideration. Perhaps we could hold a series of seminars over the next several weeks and study the impact this will have on our population." The eyes of the luminous fish grew sad. "No, this is a matter of faith. You jump and trust the river will take you to the sea. Now, will you all follow me?" A few fish, including a very old fish who refused to give up the dream of better things, and a young fish who dared to hope in new things, trusted the luminous fish and jumped as he showed them how. And the current swept them to an exciting new life in the great sea. But the rest of the fish continued swimming in circles, hunting and fighting over water bugs. Today's gospel, we hear every year the story of the Transfiguration. We hear it on the second Sunday of Lent. It's found in Matthew 17, Luke 9, and I just proclaimed Mark chapter 9. This is another one of those stories that John completely omits. The story opens up with Jesus going to the mountaintop with three hand-picked disciples, Peter, James, and John. Why does he go to the mountaintop? Because when you go to the Bible, the mountaintop is where you go when you want to have a revelation from God. That's where Moses went. That's where Elijah went. That's where Abraham went, and so on and so on. It's the place that everyone knew if you stood a chance to hear from God, that's where it would take place. People have asked me, why did he take Peter, James, and John? Who knows? But what's interesting, the same three will be taken with him when he goes into the Garden of Gethsemane to pray his prayer of agony. So for some reason, he had a special plan for Peter, James, and John. But while they're there, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Jesus is transformed, we are told, before their very eyes. The Greek verb metamorphose is difficult to translate into English, but what it means in essence, he is changed completely in appearance. In fact, Mark goes on to say that his clothes were dazzlingly white. Isn't it interesting in Exodus 34:30, when Moses looks at God through the burning bush, his face becomes dazzlingly white. It's the Bible writer's way of saying there's just an out-of-the-world appearance now of Jesus. And we're told, all of a sudden, Moses and Elijah appear. What's the deal with Moses and Elijah? Well, Moses was one of the great patriarchs. He was the one that helped lead them from slavery in Egypt into the wilderness, into the promised land. He was looked upon as the figure who represented the law. Elijah in 2 Kings never died. He was taken up to heaven in a fiery chariot, and Jews believed that he may return. But he was looked upon as the greatest prophet of all. So there they are. Mark says they're conversing about something. Mark does not tell us the content of the conversation. They're just conversing, that is. And then Peter, who always manages to get at least one foot into his mouth, and more often two, looks at the Lord and says, wow. This is incredible. How about I build 3 tents or booths so that we can stay up here and enjoy this experience? Now, Peter, like I say, is always getting his foot into his mouth. He says some of the just incredibly illogical things when you thought he knew better. But you know what? Let's don't sell Peter down the road just yet. Because you see, this whole talk about booths or tents is a very important statement on Peter's part. Many years before Jesus came on the scene, centuries before he came on the scene, the Jews celebrated an agricultural festival called the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Sukkot was its technical name. We read about it in Leviticus 23 and Deuteronomy 16. It started out as being a harvest festival. And what would happen whenever the first of the barley, the first of the wheat came in, they would cut down the first and the best portion. Then they would make a pilgrimage from wherever you were to Jerusalem. They would build these booth-like structures, several in a row. They would sit in these booths after they offered their harvest to the temple priest. They would pray for 8 days. They would sing the Psalms. They would dance. They would eat. They would drink. They would dance. They would drink. They would dance. They would drink. Kinda. It was a wonderful celebration. But about 100 years or so before Jesus came on the scene, the shift in meaning of that feast began to happen. It was believed, according to the 9th chapter of the prophet Amos, that God's kingdom was going to come, and it was going to come while people were sitting in those booths celebrating the Feast of Sukkot. And so when Mark looks and he sees Elijah and Moses, these great figures, he sees all this glory, he's thinking, let's stay up here and build these booths because the kingdom of God is going to happen while we're up here. Let's don't go down there into the valley anymore. Well, Jesus will not allow that. There's work to be done, you see. But then something amazing happens. The heavens open up, and we hear that thunderous voice that we heard back in Mark chapter 1, verse 11. Right after Jesus had been baptized by John the Baptist, you remember the skies opened up and we heard the voice say, "This is my son, my chosen one." Well, now we hear similar words with a few new words. "This is my beloved son," and then the command, "Listen to him." Well, they come off the mountain, and Jesus says to his disciples, as we've heard many times already in Mark's gospel, "Shh, say nothing to anyone." Why? Because remember, these disciples have only seen the 4th of July. They have not seen agony and pain yet. They need to get the whole picture. Jesus does not want them jumping to conclusions here. But then as they leave the mountain, and leave they must, they begin whispering to one another, "What's this rising from the dead stuff mean? What's the point of this passage?" I've been sharing with people this weekend one of my favorite tools, one of the tools that makes me feel powerful in this life, is the VCR control. Oh, I can climb mountains with that control. And I use it practically speaking. You know, sometimes people say, "Oh, did you see that movie? That's a great movie." And me, with my ADD, it's got to grab me the first couple of minutes or I'm bored to death. And so I'll watch a movie that somebody recommends, and then I end up falling asleep if it doesn't grab me. Now, with this VCR or DVD control, I can push the forward button, I can fast forward and check the movie out. If I don't like it, I turn it off and go to sleep anyway. This is what's happening to the Lord. These disciples get a privileged glimpse of what's going to happen to him on the other side of Calvary. It's mind-boggling. It's beyond their comprehension. They have never seen anything like this before. No wonder Peter is excited and terrified at the same time. This is huge. But this privileged glimpse did not stop them from falling apart when the going got tough on Calvary. They fled like cowards. But you know what? This picture is meant for us as well. Oh yeah, it's a sign of what's going to happen to us if we remain firm in our faith in Jesus when we are raised from the dead. But I would like to suggest to you that the implication of this picture is important before we take our last breath. Because what this passage says to us is that change is possible for us all. We can become new people, not just on the other side, but here and now. What's the problem? We fear change more than we fear death itself. That little story about the puddle is a very, very vivid example of those fish who were swimming in circles and eating water bugs day after day after day, and they were given an opportunity to go into the sea, to go where fish need to be, to experience a whole new existence and a way of living. But they were fearful to take the leap because the place where they were, that little puddle of water, felt safe and familiar. They couldn't imagine not being around their fish friends. They couldn't imagine a diet of anything other than water bugs. The same thing happens to us in this life. A number of years ago, I was called out to anoint a 34-year-old man. He was a super salesman for his company based out of Pittsburgh. His mother-in-law called me because she said he was drinking himself to death. When I went to the hospital to anoint him, I'll never forget, he didn't look anything like what I expected. I figured I would see an ashen or gray-looking, shriveled-up guy. But he actually looked good. And so we talked a little bit, and basically he told me that he must give up drinking. He must stop drinking. He'd been drinking for years. And he said his doctor told him, if you do not stop drinking, if you drink one more time, you're going to die. And so his doctor was due to release him the next day. We prayed. I anointed him. I told him to lean on me if he needed anything. Rather than to pick up the bottle, he agreed he would do so. He got home. Within 2 days, he drank. Within a week, he was dead at the age of 34. Why? We fear change more than we fear death itself. You see, to go on the road to recovery, people with addictions, and especially in the case of alcoholism, have to make some profound changes. And it's more than just saying, I won't drink again. You literally have to change locations in terms of where you tend to go and spend time. If you used to go to Joe's Bar and Grill on 3rd Avenue, and you used to drink there from the time you got off from work to midnight, and you went home drunk for years every day, you can no longer go to Joe's Bar and Grill. In fact, you better stay away from 3rd Avenue. Why? Because subconscious factors are working in the back of my brain that make me want to just move to 3rd Avenue because it feels safe and comfortable like the little puddle. And so people who are truly trying to kick the addiction of alcohol and to work towards serenity must change sometimes people with whom they associate. You can't hang around with the drinking buddies anymore. You have to change locations. Sometimes you have to change homes. That's frightening. A number of years ago, I was coming into the rectory on a Sunday night after going to a hospital call. I was fumbling for my key to the front door, and all of a sudden I heard the bushes down below rustling. And this woman came out and came up on the front porch. She was one of our parishioners. She was a young mother with 6 little children. She was black and blue and bloody through most of her nostrils. Her husband, a college professor, PhD, and an alcoholic, an untreated alcoholic, beat her black and blue. I took her into the rectory. We took care of her and the kids overnight. We washed her, got her squared away, and then I called a sister, a nun, who was involved with domestic violence shelters. We got her into a shelter. She called me up within the course of the week and said her husband called in tears, wanting to see her, wanting her to come back home. What should I do, Father? I said, do not go back home. She went back home. Within a month, she was back at the rectory again, black and blue and bleeding from her nose. Why? We fear change more than we fear death itself. Change is frightening to us. In terms of relationships, the most frequented sin that gets confessed or people talk about who really want to change is the sin of gossip. So many times people come and they are overwhelmed. Why can't I stop gossiping? People will say, you know, I go to work and there's just these people, these friends, and I'm afraid not to gossip with them because what happens, I get sucked in, and then I don't want them thinking I'm some goody two-shoes, or I don't want to think them that I'm better than they are. But when we get done, I feel terrible about myself. And certainly she does. I can understand that. But the problem is she's hanging with toxic friends. It happens to teenagers a lot, and kids in middle school. You know, they get around a group of toxic friends ruled by a bully. That bully is like a puppeteer who orchestrates what the other children do. They do what the bully tells them to do out of fear. It's difficult for kids to break out of that. They have to literally change friends, from toxic friends to healthy friends. But we fear change more than we fear death itself. My brothers and sisters, the season of Lent is all about change. And I'm not talking about that word that is used flippantly by politicians in Washington. I'm talking about a sincere and profound change of heart. We heard the call to change back on Ash Wednesday. When the ashes were imposed, we heard, turn away from sin and be faithful to the gospel. It's difficult to grow beyond the normal way of doing stuff. It's difficult to change. So how do I make it happen? First of all, I got to be sick and tired of being sick and tired of the way that I'm living. Only then can I get motivated then to recognize what the problem is with my life. Then I have to make a firm resolve to change, to put one step in front of another. And I need to pitch the toxic friends and get people around me who will love me and support me sacrificially and unconditionally. And then I walk the walk with God's grace. And be prepared to stumble and fall. It's difficult to change. But no matter how many times we fall and how hard we may fall, the Lord is there to help pick us back up. Impossible? No. All things are impossible with God, are possible with God. So let us pray that unlike those fish in that little puddle who couldn't move beyond that puddle, we may look beyond who we are to the possibilities of a new person. God can make that happen if and only when we surrender our lives to Him. Let us now profess our faith.